The silver silk felt like razor wire against my bruised skin. I kept my spine perfectly straight, terrified that if I slouched even a fraction of an inch, the heavy fabric of the gown would press into the massive, purple contusion blooming across my left shoulder blade. The pain was a dull, rhythmic throb. It kept perfect time with the string quartet playing in the corner of the grand ballroom. We were at the Peninsula Hotel. It was the premier charity gala of the Chicago autumn season. The room was a blinding sea of crystal chandeliers, clinking champagne flutes, and the suffocating scent of expensive floral perfumes mixed with gin. Trenton stood beside me, radiating the kind of aggressive, flashy charisma that only new money real estate developers possessed. He was holding court with 2 city aldermen and a prominent banking executive. To them, he was a visionary. To me, he was the architect of my daily terror. He laughed at something the banker said, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the marble pillars. As he laughed, his right hand rested casually on my waist. To the outside world, it looked like the affectionate touch of a devoted partner, but beneath the folds of the silver dress, his fingers were digging violently into my hip bone. I focused entirely on my breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, exhale for 4. It was a survival tactic I had perfected over the last 2 years. If I showed the pain, if my smile faltered for even a single second, there would be severe consequences when we returned to the penthouse. Trenton demanded absolute perfection. He had chosen this dress for me. He had chosen my shoes, my jewelry, and the exact shade of my crimson lipstick. I was no longer an independent art gallery curator with a mind of my own. I was a polished trophy. A silent, glittering accessory designed exclusively to make him look powerful. And when the heavy oak doors of our Gold Coast apartment closed, I was his punching bag. The air in the ballroom was stifling, thick with the heat of 300 bodies and the heavy weight of unspoken secrets. I watched the wives of the moguls and politicians drifting past us in their designer gowns. They wore diamonds that cost more than most people made in a decade. They smiled with perfectly white teeth and nodded obediently at their husbands' jokes. I wondered how many of them were counting their breaths just like me. I wondered how many of them had expensive foundation expertly applied over split lips or fractured ribs. The hyper-wealthy echelons of Chicago operated on a strict, unbreakable code of silence. You did not look too closely at the bruises. You did not ask why a woman flinched when a crystal glass was set down too hard on a table. You simply drank your champagne, admired the floral arrangements, and pretended the monsters in the room were gentlemen. Trenton shifted his weight, leaning closer to the alderman to discuss zoning permits for a new high-rise in the Loop. As he moved, his thumb slid up from my hip and pressed sharply into the soft flesh just beneath my jawline. He didn't even look at me. His eyes remained locked on the politician, but the pressure of his thumb was a clear, terrifying warning. I had been staring off into space for too long. I was failing to be the attentive, adoring partner. I quickly adjusted my posture, forcing a bright, empty smile onto my face, tilting my head to feign interest in the conversation. The pressure on my jaw eased slightly, but the threat lingered in the cold air between us. That was when I saw him. He was standing alone near the massive arched windows that looked out over the dark, freezing expanse of Lake Michigan. In a room full of men desperately trying to prove their importance, he was entirely, unnervingly still. He didn't have the frantic, nervous energy of the developers or the loud, boisterous arrogance of the politicians. He occupied space differently, like a man who owned the ground he stood on simply by existing. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, but there was nothing flashy about him. He looked like a shadow that had somehow detached itself from the wall and taken human form. I didn't know his name then. I only knew that he was watching me. And he wasn't looking at the expensive silver dress or the heavy diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. He was looking at the rigid, unnatural line of my shoulders. He was watching the way I carefully measured my breaths, the way my eyes darted toward the exits. He was reading my body language like a trauma surgeon reading a catastrophic X-ray. For a terrifying electric second, our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. His gaze was dark, heavy, and completely unreadable. But in that brief, silent exchange, I felt entirely exposed. He saw the invisible cage. He saw the terror vibrating just beneath my skin. I looked away quickly, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, but it was too late. Trenton possessed the predatory instincts of a starving wolf. He felt the subtle shift in my attention, the slight change in my breathing. He stopped talking mid-sentence. The jovial, charming mask slipped from his face, replaced instantly by a cold, dead-eyed stare. He followed my line of sight across the room, his eyes locking onto the quiet man standing by the window. I felt the muscles in Trenton's arm go completely rigid. He hated anyone who challenged his dominance, even silently from across a room. He hated the old money power and the unseen syndicate logistics that ran the deep, dark currents of Chicago. And the man by the window clearly belonged to that dangerous, untouchable world. Trenton's fingers clamped down on my elbow like a steel vice. The pain was immediate, sharp, and blinding. I gasped, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the loud chatter of the ballroom and the swelling music of the string quartet. He leaned in close, his lips brushing against my ear in what looked like an intimate whisper. His breath smelled of expensive gin and peppermint. He whispered that I was embarrassing him. He whispered that I was acting like a cheap, ungrateful distraction. He said we were going to take a little walk to the side hallway to fix my attitude. My blood ran entirely cold. The side hallway meant isolation. It meant a dark, carpeted corner where the security cameras didn't reach. It meant punishment. He began to pull me through the crowd, his grip bruising the delicate skin of my arm. I stumbled in my high heels, desperately trying to keep my balance so I wouldn't fall and make a scene. The faces of the Chicago elite blurred around me into a sickening smear of diamonds and silk. No one intervened. No one even looked down. They parted for Trenton like water, offering polite, oblivious nods as he dragged me toward the heavy oak doors at the edge of the room. Panic clawed at my throat, thick and suffocating. I knew exactly what was going to happen when those doors closed behind us. He would push me hard against the wall. He would press his forearm against my windpipe until the edges of my vision went black. He would remind me exactly who owned me, and then he would force me to walk back into the ballroom and smile. We were 10 feet from the doors when a figure stepped directly into our path. It was the man from the window. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with silver dusting the dark hair at his temples. His face was carved from granite, lined with a kind of deep structural exhaustion that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. He didn't posture. He didn't puff out his chest or raise his chin. He simply stood there, an immovable object blocking Trenton's path to the hallway. Trenton stopped abruptly, yanking me back against his side so hard my neck snapped back. He puffed himself up, his face flushing with sudden, violent anger. He demanded to know what the hell the man thought he was doing. The music seemed to fade into the background. The conversations in our immediate vicinity began to quiet down as people sensed the sudden, dangerous drop in atmospheric pressure. The man did not raise his voice. When he spoke, his tone was low, smooth, and terrifyingly calm. He told Trenton to take his hand off my arm. Trenton let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He looked around at the watching crowd, trying to rally the elite to his side. He asked loudly if this guy was out of his mind. He stated, his voice dripping with venom, that I was his partner, and that we were having a private conversation. The man did not blink. He did not shift his weight. He simply repeated the instruction, his voice dropping an octave lower. He said it was not a request. He said it was the only warning Trenton was going to get. The silence in our immediate circle became absolute. 300 of Chicago's most powerful people were suddenly watching, holding their breath. I could feel Trenton trembling with rage beside me. His grip on my arm tightened to the point of sheer agony, his fingernails biting into my skin. He was calculating the odds in his head. He was used to bullying contractors, threatening lawyers, and bribing city officials. But he was looking into the eyes of a man who did not play by the rules of polite society. This was a man who understood violence on a molecular level. The man shifted his dark gaze from Trenton to me. His eyes softened just a fraction, the coldness melting away to reveal something deeply protective. He spoke directly to me, ignoring Trenton entirely. He asked me to trust him for 30 seconds. Before I could process the words, before Trenton could even begin to react, the man stepped forward. He moved with shocking speed and grace. He reached out and gently cupped my face with both hands. His palms were warm, slightly rough, and incredibly steady. He leaned down and pressed his lips firmly against mine. It was not a romantic kiss. There was no passion or desire in it. It was a deliberate, calculated, and deeply territorial move. It was a public claiming. In front of the aldermen, the bankers, the socialites, and the politicians, this quiet, dangerous man was marking me as untouchable. He was taking Trenton's most prized possession and stripping away his ownership in the most humiliating public way possible. The shock of it paralyzed my nervous system. For the first time in 2 agonizing years, I felt completely shielded. He pulled back slowly, keeping one hand resting gently on my cheek. Trenton was practically foaming at the mouth. He lunged forward, raising his fist, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. But the man didn't even flinch. He simply turned his head and looked at Trenton. The look was so cold, so utterly devoid of humanity that Trenton froze mid-step, his fist suspended in the air. The man spoke again, his voice carrying perfectly in the dead, silent room. He dismantled Trenton with surgical, devastating precision. He stated Trenton's full legal name. He mentioned the exact address of the Gold Coast penthouse. He calmly listed the dates of my last 3 hospital visits. He mentioned the fractured wrist from last December that Trenton had forced me to claim was a skiing accident. He mentioned the bruised ribs from April, the ones that made it impossible for me to breathe without crying. He spoke of Trenton's hidden offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the bribed building inspectors. He stripped away every single layer of Trenton's carefully constructed social armor. He left him naked, exposed, and bleeding in front of the very people he desperately wanted to impress. The elite crowd murmured in shock, stepping back from Trenton as if he had suddenly caught a highly contagious plague. Trenton opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was pale, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an ally, a friend, anyone to defend him. There were none. The silence of the crowd was a total condemnation. The man lowered his hand from my face and gently wrapped his fingers around my uninjured arm. He didn't ask if I wanted to leave. He simply said it was time to go. He guided me through the crowd. The sea of expensive suits and glittering gowns parted for us in absolute, terrified silence. No one tried to stop him. No one even breathed too loudly. We walked out of the suffocating heat of the hotel ballroom and into the grand lobby. My legs felt like lead. My mind was spinning so fast I thought I might faint on the polished marble floor. We pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the biting October wind. The cold air off Lake Michigan hit my bare shoulders like a physical blow, but I barely felt it. A sleek, black-town car was idling at the curb, its engine a low, powerful hum. A stoic, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit opened the back door. The man who had taken me guided me inside, then slid into the seat next to me. The heavy doors closed with a solid, vault-like thud, instantly shutting out the noise of the city. The interior of the car smelled of rich leather and faint cedar. The engine purred, and we pulled away from the curb, leaving the glittering lights of the Peninsula Hotel behind us. I sat frozen against the door, pressing myself as far away from him as possible. My hands were trembling uncontrollably in my lap. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving behind a cold, hollow terror that threatened to swallow me whole. I had just walked out on Trenton. I had humiliated him in front of the entire city. I had destroyed his reputation in 3 minutes. When he found me, he was going to kill me. I knew it with absolute, terrifying certainty. The man beside me seemed to sense my spiraling panic. He kept his distance, pressing himself against the opposite door to give me as much physical space as possible. He spoke quietly, his voice a low, steady rumble over the sound of the tires on the asphalt. He told me his name was Gabriel. He told me to breathe. He promised, with a chilling sincerity, that Trenton would never touch me again. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was packed with broken glass. Gabriel didn't push for an answer. He didn't demand gratitude or conversation. He simply laid out the reality of my new situation. He told me we were going to his home in Lincoln Park. He explained his boundaries with absolute, unwavering clarity. He said I would have my own room on the 2nd floor of the house. He said the door had a heavy deadbolt that locked from the inside. He promised that he would never enter my room without my explicit permission. He promised that he would never lay a hand on me. I finally found my voice. It came out as a pathetic, broken whisper. I asked him why he was doing this. Men like him did not save women like me out of the goodness of their hearts. In the world I lived in, there was always a price. There was always a debt to be paid in blood or compliance. Gabriel looked out the window at the passing streetlights. The deep exhaustion in his face seemed to settle into his bones. He was quiet for a long time, watching the city blur past the tinted glass. When he finally answered, his voice was heavy with an old, unhealed grief. He told me about his younger sister. He described her laugh, the way she used to paint, the way she trusted the wrong man. He spoke of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but was rotting from the inside. He told me that he had been too busy building his empire, too busy managing the logistics of the underworld, to notice the bruises she tried to hide with heavy makeup. He told me that by the time he realized what was truly happening behind her closed doors, it was too late. He had failed to save her. He turned his head slowly and looked directly into my eyes. The intensity of his gaze made my breath catch in my throat. He said he was not going to fail again. The car turned off the busy avenue and onto a quiet, tree-lined street in Lincoln Park. The transition from the flashy, neon-lit downtown to this silent, historic neighborhood was jarring. The streets here were lined with massive, old-money homes hidden behind wrought iron fences and ancient oak trees. We pulled up to a massive, heavily fortified brownstone. It looked less like a house, and more like a fortress built to withstand a siege. There were high iron gates, thick brick walls, and security cameras tucked discreetly under the eaves. The car passed through the gates, and they clicked shut behind us with a heavy, metallic sound of absolute finality. Gabriel led me up the stone steps and unlocked the heavy oak front door. The inside of the house was a stark contrast to the cold, imposing exterior. It was incredibly warm, smelling of wood smoke, old books, and roasting herbs. The lighting was soft and golden, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. A woman in her mid-50s appeared from the hallway. She had kind, intelligent eyes and a practical, no-nonsense demeanor. Gabriel introduced her quietly as Miriam, his housekeeper. Miriam didn't ask any questions. She didn't stare at my bruised shoulder or my ruined, tear-stained makeup. She simply stepped forward and wrapped a thick, incredibly soft cashmere blanket around my shivering shoulders. She told me she had drawn a warm bath upstairs. She handed me a stack of neatly folded, oversized cotton pajamas. The simple maternal kindness of the gesture nearly broke me. I had been living in a psychological war zone for so long that I had entirely forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. Gabriel handed me a heavy, secure cell phone. He told me the line was fully encrypted and completely untraceable. He said I had exactly 3 minutes to call my younger sister, Harper, and tell her I was safe. I took the phone with shaking hands, my fingers fumbling over the keypad. Harper was a third-grade teacher living in Oak Park. She was warm, deeply emotional, and fiercely loving. She was the life I had been forced to leave behind when Trenton systematically isolated me from everyone I cared about. I dialed her number from memory. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick and raspy with sleep. When she heard my voice, she immediately started to cry. I kept it brief, just as Gabriel had instructed. I told her I had finally left Trenton. I told her I was in a safe place, and that she shouldn't try to contact me until I reached out again. I told her I loved her more than anything. Hanging up the phone felt like severing the very last tie to my old life. I was completely unmoored, drifting in a terrifying new reality. Miriam led me up the grand wooden staircase to the second floor. She showed me to a large, quiet bedroom at the far end of the hall. The bed was massive, covered in thick, heavy quilts. A fire was crackling warmly in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Miriam set the pajamas on the edge of the mattress, gave me a gentle, reassuring nod, and quietly closed the door behind her. I stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the absolute silence of the house. I walked over to the heavy wooden door. My hand hovered over the thick brass deadbolt. With a trembling breath, I turned the lock. The heavy metal mechanism slid into place with a solid, deeply reassuring click. It was the first time I had locked a door from the inside in 2 years. It was the first time I had felt even a fraction of safety. I stripped off the silver dress, letting it fall to the floor like a discarded skin. I changed into the oversized cotton pajamas, the soft fabric a balm against my bruised body. I curled into the exact center of the massive bed, pulling the heavy quilts up to my chin, and stared at the ceiling. The sheer exhaustion pulled at my bones, dragging me down into a dark, dreamless sleep. I lay perfectly still in the dark, tracking the rhythm of those footsteps until the first pale light of morning began to bleed through the heavy curtains. The transition from night to day did not bring relief. It only brought a new, sharp awareness of my physical reality. The massive bed felt like an ocean I was drowning in. I pushed the heavy quilts aside, my muscles screaming in protest. The bruise on my shoulder blade, the one Trenton had pressed his thumb into, was a tight, burning knot of agony. I walked to the window and pulled back the edge of the thick velvet drape. The Lincoln Park street below was silent, dusted with a fine, glittering layer of early morning frost. The biting October wind whipped dead leaves across the pavement. It was a completely different universe from the glass and steel cage of the Gold Coast penthouse. There were no blinding chandeliers here. There were no suffocating perfumes or fake, glittering smiles. There was only the quiet, heavy security of a fortress. I dressed in the oversized cotton pajamas Miriam had given me. I walked to the heavy wooden door and reached for the brass deadbolt. Turning it backward felt like a monumental act of courage. The click echoed loudly in the silent hallway. I opened the door and crept down the grand wooden staircase, my bare feet making absolutely no sound on the thick Persian runners. I reached the ground floor and moved toward the smell of roasting coffee. In the kitchen, a man I had never seen before was standing by the marble island. He was tall, built like a heavyweight fighter, and wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit. His eyes tracked my movement with terrifying speed, but his posture remained relaxed. He poured a cup of dark coffee and slid it across the smooth marble counter toward me. He introduced himself as Desmond. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in his chest. He told me I did not need to worry about my younger sister. He said 2 of his best men had been parked outside Harper's house in Oak Park since midnight. He assured me they would follow her to her elementary school, stand guard during her classes, and follow her home. The sudden rush of relief was so intense it made my knees buckle. I gripped the edge of the marble counter to steady myself. Trenton had always used Harper as his ultimate leverage. He had always threatened to ruin her career or hurt her if I ever tried to leave. Now, that weapon had been surgically removed from his hands. Desmond gestured toward a set of heavy oak doors at the far end of the main hallway. He said Gabriel was waiting for me in the study. I left the coffee untouched and walked down the corridor. My heart picked up a nervous, fluttering rhythm against my ribs. I knocked once on the heavy wood. Gabriel's voice, calm and impossibly deep, told me to come in. I pushed the doors open. The study was a masterpiece of dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and heavy leather furniture. It smelled of old paper, expensive cedar, and dark roast coffee. Gabriel was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. He looked exactly as he had the night before at the Peninsula Hotel. He was completely composed, wearing a fresh white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. But the faint, bruised shadows under his dark eyes suggested he had not slept a single minute. He gestured to a deep leather armchair across from his desk. I sat down, instinctively pulling my knees to my chest in a defensive posture. Gabriel folded his hands on the polished wood of his desk. He did not waste time with polite pleasantries or gentle questions about how I slept. He operated on facts and logistics. He told me that at 3 a.m, a specialized, highly trained team had entered Trenton's penthouse. My breath caught in my throat. Trenton's building was supposed to be an impenetrable fortress of private security and biometric locks. Gabriel stated calmly that his men had bypassed the building's security grid in under 4 minutes. They had packed up all of my essential clothing, my passport, my mother's vintage jewelry, and my personal financial documents. He said the bags were already unpacked and waiting in the guest room upstairs. I stared at him, completely stunned by the sheer, terrifying efficiency of his power. But Gabriel was not finished. He continued, his voice perfectly level and devoid of arrogance. He informed me that he had spent the last 8 hours systematically dismantling Trenton's business network. He had made 4 strategic phone calls to the corrupt city aldermen who usually protected Trenton's zoning permits. He had frozen 2 of Trenton's shadow accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was bleeding Trenton's real estate empire dry, brick by brick. Then, Gabriel leaned forward. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift. The cold logistics vanished, replaced by a heavy, profound sincerity. He apologized for the kiss at the gala. He said it was a tactical tool, a necessary, aggressive maneuver to mark me safely in front of 300 elite witnesses. He explained that in the underworld he operated in, a public claim was the only language a predator like Trenton would truly understand and fear. But Gabriel looked at me with a deep, heavy regret. He promised me, his voice dropping to a fierce, unwavering whisper, that he would never touch me without my explicit permission again. He promised he would never make another choice for me, no matter the circumstances. He reached into his desk drawer and slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany. He said it was time for me to decide what happened next. He was giving me the absolute choice to press formal criminal charges. He said he would support whatever decision I made, even if I chose to walk away and disappear. An hour later, the heavy brass doorbell rang. Miriam, the housekeeper, ushered a woman into the formal living room. She introduced herself as Valerie. She was my new lawyer. Valerie was sharp, unsentimental, and wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that looked like a suit of armor. She carried a thick leather briefcase and possessed the kind of clinical, piercing intelligence that immediately commanded respect. She did not offer me a warm hug or a sympathetic smile. We sat at the long, polished dining table. Valerie opened her yellow legal pad and clicked her silver pen. She looked me dead in the eye and told me this was going to be the hardest, most agonizing conversation of my entire life. She was absolutely right. For 2 grueling, suffocating hours, I had to verbally recount the abuse. I had to drag every humiliating, terrifying memory out of the dark corners of my mind and lay them bare on the table. I had to speak the unspeakable. I told her about the fractured wrist from last December. I explained how Trenton had forced me to lie to the emergency room doctor, claiming I had fallen during a skiing trip in Aspen. I told her about the bruised ribs from April, the ones that made it impossible for me to breathe without crying for 3 weeks. I detailed the psychological torture. I explained the way Trenton monitored my encrypted phone messages. I described the way he forced me to stand on a digital scale every Sunday morning to ensure I maintained his preferred weight. I told her about the way he used his heavy thumb against my windpipe to win trivial arguments about dinner reservations. My voice broke constantly. Tears spilled hot and fast down my cheeks, soaking the collar of my cotton shirt. My hands shook so violently I had to sit on them to keep them still. But Valerie did not offer empty sympathy. She did not pat my shoulder or tell me everything would magically be okay. Instead, she offered something far more powerful. She offered validation through absolute clinical belief. She documented every single date, every hidden injury, every whispered threat. Her cold, professional anger became a titanium shield I could hide behind. By the time she finally closed her legal pad, I felt entirely hollowed out, like a ghost haunting my own body. But for the first time in 2 years, I felt armed. The next morning brought a new, abrasive kind of exhaustion. Detective Rowland arrived at the brownstone just after 9 o'clock. She was a seasoned, no-nonsense police detective with sharp, calculating eyes and a permanent, skeptical frown. She sat in the living room, a delicate porcelain cup of Miriam's herbal tea, sitting entirely untouched on the table in front of her. She took my official police statement. Her questions were precise, probing, and deeply uncomfortable. But her focus kept shifting away from my trauma and toward the house itself. She stared at the high-definition security cameras tucked into the corners of the ceiling. She watched Desmond standing silently in the hallway like a stone gargoyle. She leaned forward, her tone laced with heavy, undeniable suspicion. She asked me why a man like Gabriel, a man with known ties to the Chicago syndicate logistics, was suddenly involved in a domestic dispute. She warned me, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, that men in Gabriel's line of work did not do massive favors for free. She asked me exactly what he was demanding in return for my safety. I looked at the detective, feeling a sudden, fierce spark of protective anger ignite in my chest. I sat up straighter, ignoring the sharp pain in my shoulder blade. I told her Gabriel had asked for absolutely nothing. I explained that he had given me a locked door, a safe place to sleep, and the power to make my own choices. I realized, as I spoke the words aloud to a sworn officer of the law, that they were entirely, undeniably true. Gabriel was a dangerous, lethal man, but his danger was directed outward, aimed squarely at the monsters of the world. Inside the thick brick walls of this brownstone, he was a sanctuary. Detective Rowland stared at me for a long, heavy moment. She finally sighed, closing her small spiral notebook with a sharp snap. She promised to push the arrest warrant through the district attorney's office by the end of the day. But as the days bled into a long, agonizingly tense week, the true psychological toll of the extraction began to set in. The protective adrenaline that had carried me through the gala, the lawyer's interrogation, and the police interview finally evaporated. It left behind a crushing, suffocating paranoia that poisoned every waking moment. I could not sleep in the massive guest bed. The open space of the mattress felt entirely too vulnerable, too exposed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Trenton's face hovering in the dark. I felt his heavy fingers digging into my hip bone. I smelled the sharp, sickening mixture of expensive gin and peppermint on his breath. I began transitioning my sleeping arrangements. I moved to the heavy leather reading chair tucked into the far corner of my room. I would pull the chair tightly against the solid wall, wrap myself in 3 thick cashmere blankets, and sleep sitting straight up. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy brass deadbolt of the door. And every single night, deep in the darkest, coldest hours, the footsteps returned. Heavy, deliberate, methodical. They would pace slowly down the length of the second-floor hallway. They would pause directly outside my locked door for exactly 10 seconds. And then they would continue. For the first 3 nights, the sound paralyzed me with fresh terror. I thought it was a threat. I thought it was a psychological tactic to remind me of my captivity. But on the 4th night, as I sat shivering in the leather reading chair, the truth finally clicked into place. The footsteps were not a threat. They were a dedicated patrol. Gabriel was not sleeping. He was walking the perimeter of the 2nd floor, standing guard outside my door to ensure that nothing and no one could ever hurt me again. The realization broke something hard and frozen inside my chest. The terrifying sound of heavy boots on hardwood slowly transformed. The footsteps became a bizarre, comforting lullaby. Late one night, unable to quiet my racing, traumatized mind, I crept downstairs to the kitchen. The massive house was silent, wrapped in the deep, freezing quiet of a brutal Chicago winter. I found Gabriel sitting alone at the marble island. The only light in the room came from the small, warm lamp over the industrial stove. He was staring down at a mug of black coffee. His broad shoulders were heavy with an invisible, crushing weight. I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder, but he sensed my presence immediately. He looked up, and the hard, dangerous lines of his face softened instantly. I walked over and sat on the wooden stool next to him. We sat in absolute silence for a long time. We simply listened to the bitter wind howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the thick, bulletproof window panes of the brownstone. I finally broke the silence. I thanked him for the footsteps. I told him I knew he was patrolling the hallway every single night. Gabriel looked away, his jaw tightening as if he were fighting a physical pain. He took a slow, deep breath that seemed to shudder in his chest. In the quiet, shadowed intimacy of the dimly lit kitchen, he let his impenetrable guard down just a fraction of an inch. He admitted, his voice barely a rough whisper, that he had deep feelings for me. He said it was a dangerous, incredibly selfish thing for him to admit out loud. My breath caught in my throat, my heart performing a sudden, violent leap. But before I could speak, before I could even process the confession, he immediately raised a hand. He stopped me cold. He stated with absolute, ironclad certainty that he refused to act on those feelings. He looked at me with a fierce, unwavering respect that brought tears to my eyes. He insisted that I was entirely too fragile, too newly free from a monster, to be burdened with his complicated emotions. He said I needed a sanctuary, a quiet place to heal, and find my own stolen voice. He told me I did not need another powerful man telling me what I wanted or how I should feel. He promised to keep his physical and emotional distance. He promised to remain nothing more than a silent shield until the day I was ready to walk out the front door on my own terms. The fragile, beautiful piece of the brownstone shattered exactly 2 days later. Valerie called my encrypted phone just after noon. Her voice was tight, completely stripped of its usual clinical, detached calm. She told me Trenton had finally been arrested. The police tactical team had found him hiding out in a cheap, run-down motel on the far industrial outskirts of the city. He was furious, highly erratic, and heavily intoxicated. But that was not the worst part of the report. When Detective Rowland's heavily armed team breached the flimsy motel room door, they found an illegal, unregistered firearm sitting on the nightstand. It was fully loaded with hollow-point bullets. The news hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I sank to the floor of the hallway, gasping for air. Gabriel's aggressive extraction at the Peninsula Hotel Gala had not just saved me from a severe beating, it had literally saved my life. Trenton had not been planning to punish me that night. He had been planning to kill me. I sat on the cold hardwood floor, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the heavy phone to my ear. But Valerie was not finished delivering the nightmare. The legal system, with all its cold, blind, infuriating bureaucracy, had delivered a devastating secondary blow. Despite the illegal firearm, despite the extensive medical documentation of my severe abuse, and despite his obvious flight risk, a corrupt city judge had granted Trenton bail. He was required to wear a GPS ankle monitor, but he was officially out of police custody. He was back on the streets of Chicago. He had access to his millions, his connections, and his bottomless rage. The terror that had been slowly receding over the past week came rushing back in a dark, suffocating tide. The invisible cage of my mind snapped shut once again, trapping me in a state of hyper-vigilant panic. A week later, Gabriel insisted I needed a change of scenery. He said the thick walls of the brownstone were beginning to feel like a beautifully decorated prison, and he could see the claustrophobia eating away at my sanity. He arranged for Desmond to drive me to Oak Park to visit my sister, Harper. The security protocols for the trip were absolute and terrifying. Desmond drove a heavily armored, black SUV. He took a convoluted, unpredictable route through the city to ensure we were not being followed by Trenton's private investigators. Harper's house was a small, cozy, yellow bungalow surrounded by ancient oak trees. When she opened the front door, I collapsed into her arms, weeping uncontrollably into her shoulder. For 3 precious hours, we sat in her sunny, cluttered living room. We drank chamomile tea and desperately pretended the world was normal. We talked about the funny things her third-grade students had said that week. We talked about new books and old movies. We tried our hardest to ignore the massive, silent, lethal presence of Desmond standing guard by the front window, his eyes constantly scanning the quiet suburban street. It was just past 4 in the afternoon. The autumn sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the living room floor. Suddenly, my encrypted phone vibrated violently on the wooden coffee table. The caller ID showed Gabriel's secure line. I answered immediately, expecting his usual calm, steady afternoon check-in. But the voice on the other end of the line was completely unrecognizable. Gabriel's tone was tight, sharp, and laced with an unprecedented, raw panic. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. He barked a single, terrifying command that made my blood run entirely cold. He told me to give the phone to Desmond immediately. I handed the heavy device to the security man, my hand shaking uncontrollably. Desmond pressed the phone to his ear. He listened for exactly 3 seconds. His stoic, professional expression vanished instantly. It was replaced by a look of absolute, lethal focus. Desmond dropped the phone onto the couch. He reached under his tailored suit jacket and drew a heavy, black firearm from his shoulder holster. He turned to us, his eyes wide and urgent. He ordered Harper and me to move to the basement. He said we needed to move right now. I asked him what was happening, my voice rising in a shrill, hysterical panic. Desmond grabbed my arm and shoved us roughly toward the narrow hallway door. He said Trenton had cut his GPS ankle monitor. He was completely in the wind, and his last known trajectory was heading straight for the Oak Park suburbs. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. A wave of pure, paralyzing nausea washed over me. We scrambled down the narrow, creaking wooden stairs into the dark, unfinished basement. The air down there smelled of damp earth, old cardboard boxes, and copper pipes. Desmond positioned us behind the heavy concrete mass of the furnace. He raised his gun, his eyes locked dead on the top of the stairs. We huddled together in the pitch blackness of the basement corner. Harper was trembling violently against my side, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. I wrapped my arms tightly around her, trying to shield her with my own body. My heart was hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against my ribs. The silence of the house above us was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. Every single second stretched into an unbearable eternity. I closed my eyes and counted my breaths, praying to a God I had not spoken to in years. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4. And then, the suffocating silence broke. The heavy oak front door upstairs crashed open with a splintering, violent boom that shook the ceiling dust loose. The floorboards groaned in agony under a sudden, massive weight. The heavy boots hit the top step with a force that shook the wooden frame of the staircase. Desmond stepped in front of us, his broad shoulders completely blocking my view of the stairs. He raised his weapon, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard, his breathing perfectly controlled and silent. A blinding beam of white light cut through the pitch blackness of the basement, sweeping over the dusty concrete floor and the old copper pipes. The light hit Desmond's chest, and for a fraction of a second, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. Then, a voice echoed down the narrow stairwell. It was a low, commanding rumble that vibrated through the damp air. Gabriel called out Desmond's name, his voice tight with an adrenaline I had never heard from him before. Desmond instantly lowered his weapon, exhaling a long, sharp breath. He called back, confirming that the basement was secure and that we were safe. The heavy footsteps descended the stairs rapidly, and Gabriel stepped into the dim light of the basement. He was not wearing his usual tailored suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up, and he held a heavy tactical flashlight in his left hand. His dark eyes swept over the basement, locking onto me, and Harper huddled behind the massive concrete furnace. The moment he saw us, the terrifying, lethal tension in his posture completely evaporated. He closed his eyes for a brief second, letting out a breath that sounded like a physical weight dropping from his chest. He walked over to us, his movements slow and deliberate so he would not startle us further. He crouched down on the dusty concrete floor, bringing himself down to our eye level. He looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my pale face and my trembling hands. He told me in a quiet, steady voice that the perimeter of the house was entirely locked down. He said he had 10 of his best men stationed outside, forming an impenetrable ring around the property. I leaned my head back against the cold concrete of the furnace, my entire body shaking as the paralyzing terror began to recede. Harper was crying softly beside me, her face buried in my shoulder. Gabriel stayed crouched on the floor with us for a long time, simply offering his silent, grounding presence until our breathing returned to normal. We stayed in that basement for 4 agonizing hours. Gabriel refused to let us move upstairs until he had absolute, verified confirmation of Trenton's location. The confirmation finally came just after 8 o'clock in the evening. Desmond's encrypted phone buzzed, and he relayed the information in a low, clinical tone. Trenton had not come to Oak Park. His blind, narcissistic panic had overridden his desire for revenge. He had been caught at a Greyhound bus station on the far south side of the city, trying to board a bus headed for the state line. He was currently in police custody, sitting in a concrete holding cell. Gabriel looked at me, his expression hardening into something cold and absolute. He promised me that Trenton's bail had already been permanently revoked by an emergency order from a federal judge. He said Trenton would remain in a maximum security county jail until the very last day of the trial. The monster was finally, truly locked in a cage. Later that night, Desmond drove us back to the heavily fortified brownstone in Lincoln Park. The house was quiet, wrapped in the deep, freezing silence of the Chicago night. I could not sleep. The adrenaline crash had left me feeling hollowed out, my nerves completely frayed and raw. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, wrapping a thick cashmere blanket tightly around my shoulders. The only light came from the small, warm lamp over the industrial stove. Gabriel was sitting at the marble island, staring down at a glass of dark amber liquid. He looked incredibly tired, the deep lines around his eyes carved by years of carrying the weight of his violent world. I walked over and sat on the wooden stool next to him. He did not look up immediately, but he pushed a steaming mug of chamomile tea across the smooth marble counter toward me. We sat in the quiet shadows for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the thick window panes. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug, staring down at the pale yellow liquid. I finally found the courage to speak the words that had been building in my chest for weeks. I told him that for the last 2 years, I had felt completely dead inside. I explained how Trenton had systematically erased my personality, my opinions, and my voice, until there was nothing left but a silent, terrified ghost. I turned my head and looked directly at Gabriel's striking, exhausted profile. I told him that his presence, his absolute honesty, and his unwavering respect for my boundaries were the only things making me feel alive again. Gabriel slowly turned his head to look at me. His dark eyes were incredibly intense, filled with a heavy, unspoken longing that made my breath catch in my throat. But I held my ground, forcing myself to finish the thought. I told him that despite how I felt, I was still broken. I said my mind was still a minefield of trauma, triggers, and paralyzing fear. I told him I was not ready for a relationship, and I did not know when I would be. I needed to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet before I could ever lean on someone else. Gabriel did not flinch. He did not look disappointed or rejected. Instead, a profound, quiet respect settled over his features. He reached out and gently tapped his knuckles against the edge of my ceramic mug. He said he understood completely. He promised he would not push. He would not ask for more, and he would wait exactly as long as I needed him to. He told me my healing was the only thing that mattered in this house. The next 16 weeks were a grueling, agonizing blur of legal preparation and psychological warfare. Winter slowly released its bitter grip on Chicago, giving way to a cold, gray spring. I spent countless hours sitting in Valerie's sterile, brightly lit downtown law office. She was absolutely ruthless in her preparation. She played the role of the defense attorney, attacking my memory, questioning my motives, and trying to twist my words. She forced me to recount the worst moments of my life over and over again until the tears stopped falling, and the raw emotion hardened into cold, undeniable fact. She told me the defense would try to paint me as a gold digger, a liar, and a hysterical woman seeking revenge. She said I had to be made of titanium when I took the stand. The morning of the trial, the sky over Lake Michigan was a heavy, bruised purple. I wore a simple, tailored navy blue suit. There were no expensive diamonds, no silver silk, and no crimson lipstick. I looked like myself again. Gabriel drove me to the courthouse in silence. He walked me to the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, his presence a massive, silent shield against the chaotic energy of the crowded hallway. He told me he would be sitting in the back row right by the door. He promised that if I looked back, he would be the first thing I saw. I walked into the courtroom and took my seat next to the state prosecutor. The room smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and nervous sweat. A few minutes later, the side door opened, and a bailiff led Trenton into the room. He was wearing a dark gray suit, but it hung loosely on his frame. 16 weeks in a county jail cell had stripped away his flashy, arrogant charisma. His skin was pale, his eyes were sunken, and the expensive haircut had grown out into a messy, unkempt style. But when he looked across the room and saw me, the old, familiar venom flashed in his eyes. He sneered, a subtle, terrifying curling of his lip that used to send me spiraling into a panic attack. I felt my heart rate spike, my hands instinctively gripping the edge of the wooden table. But then I remembered the hours in Valerie's office. I remembered the heavy deadbolt on my bedroom door. I remembered Gabriel sitting in the back row. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, and I stared right back at Trenton without blinking. For the first time in my life, he was the one who looked away first. Taking the witness stand was the most terrifying thing I had ever done. The wooden chair felt hard and exposed. The microphone amplified every slight tremor in my voice. The defense attorney was a sharp, aggressive man who paced the floor like a caged animal. He tried every tactic Valerie had warned me about. He asked why I had never called the police during the 2 years of abuse. He asked why I had stayed in the luxurious Gold Coast penthouse if I was so terrified. He tried to twist my silence into consent, but I did not break. I gripped the wooden railing of the witness box and spoke directly to the jury. I reclaimed my voice, word by agonizing word. I explained the insidious, suffocating nature of psychological control. I explained how the isolation, the financial manipulation, and the constant threat of violence had built an invisible prison around me. I refused to take a single ounce of blame for the abuse. I looked directly at Trenton and stated clearly that he was a monster who hid behind his money. When I finally stepped down from the stand, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk, but my chest felt incredibly light. The verdict came back 3 days later. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The courtroom was dead silent as the foreman stood up and read the decision. Guilty on all counts of aggravated domestic battery, unlawful restraint, and illegal possession of a firearm. The judge did not show an ounce of mercy. He sentenced Trenton to 12 years in a state penitentiary, with no possibility of early parole. I watched as the bailiff stepped forward and pulled Trenton's arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the silent courtroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The immediate aftermath of the trial was not the triumphant, joyous celebration I had imagined. When I returned to the quiet sanctuary of the Lincoln Park brownstone, a massive, crushing emptiness settled over me. The adrenaline that had fueled me for months completely evaporated. I had spent 2 years fighting to survive, and another 4 months fighting to put my abuser in a cage. Now that the war was officially over, I had absolutely no idea who I was or what I was supposed to do with my life. I spent the first 2 weeks sleeping for 12 hours a day, my body finally demanding payment for the years of hypervigilance. Gabriel recognized the dangerous void I was falling into. He gently suggested I begin intensive therapy with a trauma specialist he trusted. Her name was Dr. Eris, and her office was a quiet, sunlit room overlooking the Chicago River. Therapy was not a magical cure. It was brutal, exhausting work. I had to unlearn the survival mechanisms that had kept me alive. I had to stop counting my breaths every time a door closed too loudly. I had to stop scanning every room for the nearest exit. Dr. Eris taught me that I was not a broken object that needed to be glued back together. She told me I was a survivor who had sustained a severe injury, and like any physical wound, it required time, patience, and deliberate care to heal. Slowly, over the course of the summer, the heavy fog began to lift. I started to remember the woman I was before Trenton. I remembered that I loved the smell of oil paint and the texture of raw canvas. I remembered that I had a sharp eye for composition and a deep passion for modern art. In late August, I applied for a job curating a small, independent art gallery in the Wicker Park neighborhood. The gallery owner was a chaotic, brilliant woman who cared more about raw talent than polished resumes. She hired me on the spot. Returning to work was a revelation. I spent my days surrounded by vibrant colors, bold strokes, and passionate artists. I was making decisions again. I was choosing which paintings to feature, how to arrange the lighting, and how to price the pieces. Every small choice felt like a massive victory, a brick laid in the foundation of my new identity. As my confidence grew, my dynamic with Gabriel began to subtly shift. I was no longer the terrified, shattered victim hiding behind his broad shoulders. I moved out of the guest room and into the newly renovated 3rd floor of the brownstone. It was my own space, decorated with my own art, filled with the books and music I chose. Gabriel and I were no longer protector and protected. We were becoming 2 healing adults, navigating the quiet domestic space of the house as equals. We cooked dinner together in the evenings, arguing playfully over the right amount of garlic to put in the pasta sauce. We sat on the back patio in the cool autumn air, drinking wine and talking about everything from city politics to the history of architecture. The heavy, unspoken tension between us was still there, but it was no longer laced with fear or trauma. It was a warm, steady current pulling us slowly toward each other. By November, exactly 1 year after the gala at the Peninsula Hotel, I knew I was ready. We were walking back to the brownstone after a late dinner downtown. The biting Chicago wind was whipping off the river, carrying the faint, metallic smell of impending snow. We were crossing a heavy iron bridge, the city lights reflecting off the dark, churning water below. I stopped walking and turned to face him. Gabriel stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark wool coat. He looked at me, his dark eyes reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but it was not the frantic, agonizing rhythm of terror. It was the fast, electric pulse of genuine excitement. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. I asked him if he would like to take me on a real, official date. Gabriel stared at me, completely caught off guard. For the first time since I had met him, the terrifyingly composed, lethal man of the underworld looked genuinely nervous. He blinked, a slow, hesitant smile breaking through the hard lines of his face. He asked me if I was absolutely sure. I stepped closer, closing the physical distance between us, and told him I had never been more sure of anything in my life. The first date was an absolute, spectacular disaster. Gabriel had tried to do everything perfectly. He had booked a table at a highly exclusive, incredibly expensive Italian restaurant in the Loop, but when we arrived, there had been a massive scheduling error, and our reservation was completely lost. The maitre d' was profusely apologetic, sweating nervously under Gabriel's dark, unamused stare. I could see the old, dangerous edge creeping back into Gabriel's posture. He was preparing to demand a table, to use his quiet, terrifying influence to force the situation. I reached out and gently placed my hand on his forearm. I laughed, a real, bright sound that surprised even me. I told him I didn't want a fancy, quiet dinner anyway. I dragged him out of the restaurant and down the street to a loud, chaotic, brightly lit pizza parlor. We sat in a sticky vinyl booth, surrounded by screaming college students and blaring arcade games. We ate messy, deep-dish pizza with our hands, getting tomato sauce on our expensive clothes. Gabriel looked entirely out of place in his tailored suit, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights. But as he watched me laugh, as he watched me eat without counting calories or worrying about a digital scale, the tension melted out of his shoulders. It was the most perfect night of my life, simply because it was so incredibly normal. When we finally returned to the brownstone, the house was quiet and warm. We walked into the kitchen, the soft glow of the stove lamp casting long shadows across the marble island. Gabriel turned to face me, his expression softening into something deeply vulnerable. He reached out, his hand hovering just an inch from my face, waiting for my permission. I closed the distance. I reached up, tangling my fingers in the soft hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down to me. The kiss was nothing like the public, territorial claim at the gala. It was slow, incredibly gentle, and filled with a year's worth of unspoken longing and profound respect. It tasted like cold night air, warm spices, and absolute safety. For a long, beautiful moment, the entire world faded away, leaving only the steady, grounding rhythm of his heartbeat against my chest. But when we finally pulled apart, the atmosphere in the kitchen suddenly shifted. Gabriel did not smile. He let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 dark secrets. He took my hand, his grip firm and serious, and led me to the wooden stools at the island. He sat me down, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. He told me that before we took another step forward, I needed to know exactly what he was doing in the shadows. He confessed that for the last 6 months, he had been systematically dismantling his entire criminal empire. He was liquidating assets, cutting ties with the syndicate logistics, and burning down the dangerous world he had built. He said he was doing it because he wanted to be a man who was truly worthy of standing beside me in the light, but his voice dropped to a harsh, terrifying whisper. He warned me that the process was incredibly volatile, and it was going to take at least another 18 months to complete. He squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with a dark, undeniable fear. He told me that the Chicago underworld did not let people leave quietly, and the danger was far from over. The next 18 months were a grueling, terrifying test of endurance. The brownstone went back on full lockdown, transforming once again from a quiet sanctuary into a heavily fortified bunker. Desmond moved out of his own apartment and took over the guest room on the first floor. The security cameras were upgraded. The perimeter patrols were doubled, and the heavy iron gates at the front of the property remained permanently sealed. Gabriel became a ghost haunting his own house. He would leave long before the sun came up, slipping out the back door in a dark overcoat, his face set in lines of grim, lethal determination. He would return long after midnight, moving silently through the dark hallways so he would not wake me, but I was rarely asleep. I would sit in the leather reading chair in my bedroom, wrapped in a thick blanket, listening for the sound of his heavy boots on the stairs. When I finally heard him, I would creep out into the hallway. I would find him sitting alone in the dark kitchen, staring blankly at the marble island. He always smelled of cold asphalt, bitter coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. He was bleeding money, paying off massive debts, and severing ties with men who viewed loyalty as a blood pact. He was systematically burning down the empire he had spent 2 decades building. It was a highly volatile, incredibly dangerous process. Every time he walked out the front door, a cold, paralyzing fear gripped my chest. I knew the Chicago underworld did not forgive easily, and they certainly did not let their most valuable assets walk away without extracting a heavy toll. My own mind was a chaotic, exhausting battlefield during those long months. The trial was over, and Trenton was locked in a maximum security cell. But he still haunted my sleep. The trauma did not simply vanish because the gavel had fallen. I would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming until my throat was raw. My hands would claw frantically at my own neck, entirely convinced that his heavy fingers were pressing into my windpipe. I would feel the phantom weight of the silver silk dress tightening around my ribs like a razor wire noose. Gabriel would rush into my room, his face pale with panic, but he always remembered his promise. He would stop exactly 3 feet from the edge of the bed, raising his hands to show he was unarmed and unthreatening. He would speak to me in a low, steady rumble, repeating my name, telling me the date, and reminding me that the door was locked. He would stand there in the dark, a massive, silent shield, until my breathing slowed and the terrifying hallucinations faded back into the shadows. Trenton refused to let me go quietly. He tried to reach me from inside his concrete cell, using the only weapon he had left. Valerie, my lawyer, intercepted the mail before it could ever reach the brownstone. She came to the art gallery one rainy Tuesday afternoon, her tailored suit damp from the Chicago drizzle. She walked into my small, cluttered office and placed a thick stack of cheap lined envelopes on my desk. The handwriting on the front was erratic, sharp, and deeply familiar. Valerie stood by the door, her expression entirely clinical and detached. She told me Trenton had been writing to me twice a week for the last 3 months. She said the letters were filled with manipulative apologies, grand promises of change, and veiled, pathetic threats. She asked me, in a perfectly neutral tone, if I wanted to read them. I stared at the stack of envelopes. A wave of the old, familiar nausea rose in my stomach, cold and bitter. My hands began to tremble, the phantom pain throbbing in my left shoulder blade. But then I looked around my office. I looked at the vibrant, beautiful paintings leaning against the walls, waiting to be hung. I looked at the schedule I had created, the artists I had discovered, and the life I was slowly, painstakingly building. I reached out and picked up the thick stack of letters. I did not open a single one. I walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting in the corner of the room. I turned the machine on, the motor humming with a loud, aggressive growl. I fed the envelopes into the metal teeth, one by one. I watched the cheap paper splinter and tear, turning his manipulative words into meaningless, jagged confetti. The sound of the blades destroying his voice was the most beautiful, satisfying music I had ever heard. Valerie watched me in silence. When the last envelope disappeared into the machine, she gave me a single, sharp nod of approval, turned on her heel, and walked out of the gallery. Therapy with Dr. Eris became my absolute anchor during that turbulent year. Her office overlooking the Chicago River was a quiet, neutral space where I could completely fall apart without fear of judgment. We moved past the initial shock of the trauma and entered the deepest, darkest phase of healing, the anger phase. For months, I was consumed by a blinding, suffocating rage. I was furious at Trenton for stealing 2 years of my youth, my dignity, and my voice. I was furious at the elite society of Chicago, the politicians and the bankers who had looked at my bruises and chosen to drink their champagne in silence. But most of all, I was violently, agonizingly angry at myself. I hated the woman I had been. I hated her for staying, for counting her breaths, for forcing a bright, empty smile while she was being destroyed from the inside out. Dr. Eris stopped me mid-sentence one afternoon as I was pacing the floor of her office, crying tears of pure, hot frustration. She told me to sit down. She told me to hold my hands out in front of me and look at them. I stared at my trembling fingers, my knuckles white with tension. Dr. Eris leaned forward, her voice carrying a heavy, undeniable authority. She told me that those hands had survived a psychological war zone. She said that the woman I used to be did exactly what she had to do to keep me alive. She explained that guilt was a useless, parasitic emotion designed to keep victims permanently trapped in the past. She told me I had to stop hating the terrified girl in the silver dress. I had to learn to thank her for surviving, and then I had to let her go. It was the hardest psychological work I had ever done, but slowly, the suffocating weight of the self-hatred began to lift. I started pouring that massive, raw energy into my work at the gallery. I stopped playing it safe. I curated an entire, massive exhibition, centered around the concept of invisible cages and domestic isolation. I sourced aggressive, visceral pieces from unknown local artists who painted with raw, bleeding emotion. It was a bold, unapologetic, and deeply controversial collection. The opening night of the exhibition was a massive success. The gallery was packed with art critics, local collectors, and curious buyers. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the vibrant, chaotic energy of the crowd. I was not wearing silver silk. I was wearing a sharp, tailored crimson dress that I had chosen and paid for myself. I was speaking to a prominent art critic, defending the composition of a particularly aggressive abstract piece. I was arguing my point with passion, intelligence, and absolute confidence. In the middle of the conversation, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the gallery window. I stopped talking for a fraction of a second. I realized I was not just rebuilding my old personality. The trauma had burned the old version of me to the ground. But the fire had left behind a foundation of solid titanium. I was meeting an entirely new version of myself. She was sharper, stronger, and fiercely protective of her own boundaries. And for the first time in my entire life, I deeply, genuinely loved the woman I was becoming. The turning point for Gabriel came in late November, exactly 18 months after his confession in the kitchen. It was the final night of his transition. He had told me before he left the house that morning that this was the last meeting, the final severance. I paced the hardwood floors of the brownstone for 14 agonizing hours. Desmond stood by the front window, his posture rigid, his hand resting constantly on the grip of his holstered weapon. The silence in the house was so heavy it felt like the air pressure before a massive tornado. Just as the first pale gray light of morning began to bleed over the horizon, the heavy iron gates clicked open. The front door unlocked with a loud, echoing thud. Gabriel walked into the foyer. He looked like he had been dragged through hell. His face was heavily bruised, a dark purple contusion swelling along his jawline. His knuckles were split, raw, and bleeding onto his cuffs. His expensive, dark-tailored suit was torn at the shoulder and covered in dust and ash. I froze at the top of the stairs, my heart stopping entirely in my chest. But then he looked up at me. The heavy, suffocating shadow that had hung over his eyes for decades was completely, miraculously gone. The deep, structural exhaustion that had always weighed down his broad shoulders had vanished. He looked battered, bleeding, and entirely free. He walked up the stairs slowly, his boots heavy on the wood. He stopped on the landing, just a few feet away from me. He let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty his lungs of 20 years of toxic air. He looked at me, a slow, beautiful smile breaking through the hard, bruised lines of his face. He told me it was done. The debts were paid in full. The ties were permanently severed. He was out. The transition into our new reality was jarring, beautiful, and deeply profound. A man who had spent his entire adult life managing the violent, high-stakes logistics of the underworld suddenly had nothing but quiet time. He did not know how to sit still. He bought a small, struggling coffee roasting business in a quiet, working-class neighborhood on the north side. He traded his intimidating, tailored suits for heavy flannel shirts, worn denim, and thick leather work boots. He spent his early mornings experimenting with roasting temperatures, sourcing raw beans from small, independent farms in Colombia and Ethiopia. I would visit him at the shop on my days off from the gallery. I would sit at a small wooden table in the corner, drinking a dark roast, and simply watch him work. I watched him interact with normal, everyday customers. I watched him talk about flavor profiles and roasting times with a genuine, quiet passion. Watching him work with his hands, watching the deep lines of stress slowly fade from his face, was like watching a man learn how to breathe for the very first time. He was no longer the terrifying shadow of the Peninsula Hotel. He was just Gabriel. My transition into his life was slow, deliberate, and entirely on my own terms. I started by leaving a book on his nightstand, then a sweater draped over the back of his leather reading chair. Eventually, I packed up my clothes from the third floor and moved them into the massive wooden dressers in his room. Sleeping next to him was a revelation. There was no fear. There was no hypervigilance, no counting my breaths, no lying perfectly still to avoid waking a monster. There was only the heavy, warm weight of his arm draped over my waist. There was only the steady, grounding rhythm of his heartbeat against my back. 3 years after the night he pulled me out of the glittering cage of the gala, we got married. It was not a grand, expensive affair. There were no corrupt politicians, no flashy real estate moguls, and no blinding crystal chandeliers. There was no silver silk, and there were no forced, empty smiles. We stood in the backyard of the Lincoln Park brownstone. The biting October wind had given way to the soft, quiet snow of early December. The trees were bare, their dark branches dusted with white, creating a beautiful, silent canopy over our heads. The guest list consisted of exactly 5 people. Harper stood beside me, wearing a thick wool coat, weeping happy, uncontrollable tears into a crumpled tissue. Miriam and Desmond stood near the back door of the house. They watched us with fierce, protective pride. their faces glowing in the warm light spilling from the kitchen windows. Valerie, my sharp, unsentimental lawyer, officiated the ceremony. She wore her usual charcoal gray suit, but her clinical demeanor had softened into genuine, profound warmth. I wore a simple, long-sleeved white dress that I had chosen myself. It was comfortable, warm, and entirely mine. When it was time for my vows, I did not speak of fairy tales. I did not speak of knights in shining armor or magical rescues. I looked directly into Gabriel's dark, steady eyes. I held his large, scarred hands in mine. I told him that he did not save me. I told him that I saved myself. But he was the one who gave me the safe place to do it. I told him he was the locked door, the quiet room, and the steady ground I needed to rebuild my shattered mind. I promised him that I was not marrying him out of gratitude or a need for protection. I promised to choose him deliberately and freely every single day for the rest of my life. Gabriel did not speak for a long moment. He simply looked at me, his eyes shining with a deep, overwhelming emotion that he did not try to hide. He slid a simple, unadorned gold band onto my finger. He promised to spend the rest of his life standing in the light beside me. 2 years later, I gave birth to our daughter. We named her Kiara Harper Thorne. The physical exhaustion of motherhood was a completely different kind of heavy. It was not the draining, soul-crushing fatigue of surviving domestic terror. It was a beautiful, purposeful, life-affirming exhaustion. I would wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of her sharp, demanding cries echoing through the baby monitor. I would drag myself out of the warm bed, my muscles aching, the floorboards creaking softly under my bare feet. But I was never alone. Gabriel was always awake before me. I would walk into the dimly lit nursery and find him standing by the window. I would watch this massive, dangerous man, a man who used to command the darkest, most violent corners of Chicago, gently rock a tiny, fragile infant to sleep. His large, scarred hands would cradle her small head with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. He would hum a low, off-key lullaby, his deep voice vibrating in his chest, instantly calming her frantic cries. The contrast between his violent past and our gentle present was a daily, breathtaking miracle. He provided a deep, unshakable safety that allowed me to simply be a mother. I did not have to worry about the door. I did not have to worry about the shadows. I only had to worry about exactly how much formula to mix and what time she needed her next nap. The true climax of my healing did not happen in a dramatic courtroom. It did not happen in Dr. Eris's office. And it did not happen on the night of my art gallery opening. It happened on a completely ordinary, unremarkable Wednesday afternoon. The house was quiet. The winter sun was streaming through the thick, bulletproof glass of the kitchen windows. It cast warm, golden squares of light across the polished hardwood floor. Gabriel was standing at the industrial stove, wearing a faded gray t-shirt, stirring a large pot of homemade soup. He was humming softly under his breath, occasionally tossing a piece of chopped carrot to the dog resting by his feet. Kiara was sitting in her high chair at the marble island. She was babbling happily, smearing bright orange sweet potatoes across her plastic tray and into her dark hair. I was sitting on the wooden stool next to her, a cup of warm chamomile tea resting in my hands. I looked at my husband. I looked at my daughter. I listened to the quiet, domestic sounds of my home, the bubbling of the soup, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the soft thud of the dog's tail hitting the cabinets. And then, it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was completely, ordinarily happy. For years, I had lived with a deep, waiting dread. I had always believed that happiness was a trick. I believed it was a temporary illusion that would eventually demand a terrible, violent payment. I had always been waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had been waiting for the monster to return, for the illusion to shatter, for the invisible cage to snap shut around me once again. But as I sat in that sunlit kitchen, breathing in the smell of roasting herbs and warm tea, I realized the dread was entirely gone. The waiting was over. The other shoe did not exist. The piece was real, it was solid, and it belonged entirely to me. I reflected on the long, agonizing journey that had brought me to this exact moment in time. I thought about the terrified, hollowed-out woman in the silver silk dress. I thought about the way she counted her breaths to survive the blinding pain of a bruised shoulder. I thought about the grueling, tear-soaked hours in Valerie's office. I thought about the terrifying, exposing moments on the witness stand, staring down the man who had tried to erase my existence. I thought about the endless, exhausting, beautiful work of therapy. Gabriel had been my shield. He had stood between me and the monsters of the world. He had provided the locked door, the heavy deadbolt, and the quiet space to breathe. But he had not walked the path for me. He merely provided the door. I was the one who found the courage to turn the heavy brass handle. I was the one who walked through it. I went to therapy. I reclaimed my career and my passion for art. I faced my abuser in a court of law and refused to let him break me. I built this beautiful, chaotic, ordinary life with my own 2 hands. I was the architect of my own salvation. Flash forward 7 years. I am 38 years old. I am standing by the large, arched window in the master bedroom of the brownstone. Outside, the Chicago winter is in full, brutal force. The biting wind off Lake Michigan is whipping through the ancient, bare branches of the oak trees. A soft, quiet, heavy snow is blanketing the quiet streets of Lincoln Park, turning the city into a silent, glittering snow globe. I press my warm hand against the cold, thick glass. I am no longer counting my breaths. I am no longer cataloging my bruises, hiding my opinions, or scanning the room for the nearest exit. I close my eyes and listen to the sounds echoing up from the first floor of the house. I hear the deep, rumbling, joyous sound of Gabriel's laughter. I hear the bright, chaotic shrieks of Kiara and her younger brother as they chase the family dog down the long wooden hallway. I hear the familiar clatter of ceramic plates as Miriam sets the large dining room table for dinner. It is the sound of a life fully, deeply lived. It is the sound of absolute, unbreakable freedom. I turn away from the window, a deep, resonant smile spreading across my face. I walk out of the bedroom, my bare feet making a soft, steady, confident rhythm on the hardwood floor. I walk downstairs to join the beautiful, triumphant life I built.